Okay, thank you very much. So I'm expecting or I'm experiencing some difficulties with the internet connection. So in case if something is not working, just let me know. Um, Firstly, I wanted to thank the STEM Village organizers for putting this program together. And it's really great privilege for me to actually present something in this meeting, which I would otherwise not be able to present traveling to the UK currently, or even uh, even if there is no corona quarantine. Probably the visa issues are going to be more difficult for me to travel and present there. So that also gives me an opportunity to talk about something that I'm more passionate about in changing the larger picture about how we do science and research in general, rather than my own research work. So I think it's also good that after hearing something about anthropology, then we can actually humanize the context of how we do science currently. Um, so I will. So before presenting myself, I present the global community that I am part of. I'm part of different communities that are um, doing work in open science and putting transparency and responsible behaviors in scientific research in their foreground. And I've been fortunate enough to be part of eLife Early Career Advisory Group and also eLife community ambassadors who work towards putting open science into the biomedical and life sciences framework. I'm also part of the larger global OpenCon community, where we discuss about scholarship or open scholarship, open data, and open education among early career researchers. I was also fortunate to be part of a smaller team where the Triangle Scholar Communication Institute set up on disrupting colonial open science. And I'm also part of several other networks that are local and regional. For example, the Open Access India, Getting an Open Science Meetup, and Max Planck Open Access Ambassadors and Alumni Network of my alma mater. So that brings me to introduce myself. My name is Vinodh, and I am a Stardust with consciousness. What that means is I'm a person who is querying at each moment, and uh, I could pass as a cisgender male person, and that is a privilege that I hold. And I come from India, and I've moved to different continents, and I've lived in uh, 2 different continents, and I speak 4 different languages, and these are all part of my identity. And I do research with fruit flies, the Drosophila, which are kind of depicted here in a funny way. So I look at them, their actions and motions, and how they behave, and how the functions of each of those organs are inside. So that is what I dedicate my scientific work for. And I'm also interested in looking at circadian clock and sleep, which is also shown by the cartoon that is over there. So much about introducing myself, but we should also acknowledge the fact that we are in a very hard situation where this pandemic has shown how critical it is for most of us to come stronger and keep our mental health by spending less time worrying about the lost scientific productivity and spending more time keeping ourselves healthy. So I'm trying to work from home, but there were a lot of setbacks on that. And meanwhile, I'm also spending most of my energy in fighting actually false information, which spreads around by volunteering myself into different groups in social media, and also helping my family who are far across, and using this time to really two things that are needed at the moment. So if anything that this pandemic has shown us, we are also constantly reflecting on the values that we are taught, or the values that we are supposed to follow. And that brings me to thinking about the global crisis that we have currently with the pandemic, and also the global research crisis. So since we are all complaining about the lost productivity, so I would actually encourage you to watch this movie, which is Paywall. So that actually puts a nice perspective of why this is necessary, or what's the problems with current scientific methods that we are pursuing, starting from access to research materials that are published. And even in the published material, there are a lot of research that are not reproducible, or one couldn't build upon something. And there's always a problem of filter selection, because we have enormous amount of journals, and we are always evaluated based on certain metrics that are very, very obscure. But in this kind of current crisis, one would think if we can actually fix that, in order to fix that, we need to actually acknowledge and realize that we have an epistemic caveat. We all want to do 21st century science, and then we want to document our research using tools that we have at the moment. But the problem comes when we want to communicate the good science that we do, which is using the 17th century model, where we limit the scientific communication based on number of pages, or the number of articles that can be published in any given amount of time. Although we have the power of internet that can actually put all research materials immediately available to anyone who has access to internet. So this pandemic has also shown us that research that is shared freely and quickly is what is very critical in solving global crisis. So if someone has to ask me, then I would say we cannot go back to our regular business or regular research as usual and keep locking up the world's research behind things like paywalls and non-reproducible science. There's also a large problem with the way that we evaluate how how the way we communicate science, and that brings us to a lot of problems on what we face currently today on scholarly communication. So you might have seen a few of the open source projects that are dealing with the current pandemic. I haven't listed all of them exhaustively, but just giving you two different examples that collect open source data and provide valuable solutions to the current pandemic. Not only these, but there were also other open source projects that were existing earlier in order to solve a pandemic or solve a crisis that nobody was really caring about initially. For example, open source malaria, that's a project where they were putting people or lives before profit. So all the projects that are done using open source or within the open source malaria framework will not be patented. Hence, it is available for the public good rather than for profit. Not only during times of pandemic, but we also have other projects, for example, in neuroscience, to astronomy, and also in mathematics. There are several projects that use open source idea in order to improve the whole scientific rigor amongst those communities. So if you ask if data sharing is open science about, so is there a reason why you should be really sharing data? Because now we realize that sharing is caring, and sharing data is very common among big data, big data fields. And one must also realize that efficient and good science is driven by data sharing. And data sharing is one key element of open science, but that alone is not open science. So then one would ask, what is open science? So that is the definition for open science, which is provided by the Research Information Network, which says science that's carried out and communicated in a manner which allows others to contribute, collaborate, and add to the research effort with all kinds of data, results, and protocols made freely available at different stages of the research process. Currently, we are only focusing on the final output, which might either be the publication or probably an interim product that is data, which has currently got our focus because of this pandemic. But what truly would be an open science is to open all the stages of research life cycle. In the research life cycle, we usually have a designing or the hypothesis stage where that is usually locked because nobody wants to be scooped. And things are slowly changing with things like pre-registration studies and so on. So they are actually open methodologies where you can publish your hypotheses and then you can build upon by collaborating with others and getting early feedback. So at every stage of these research, the whole research life cycle, we can make everything open. And that is probably one of the ways we can support reproducibility, whereby asking the scientific community to share not just the final product that is the paper, but also the data that is associated with it and the methods and the codes that they use to analyze the data and so on. The idea here is to publish early and get early feedback so that we refine things much easier than losing a lot of time and effort of large scientific communities that work in competition rather than in collaboration. So that means then science, open science should just be simply science, because that's indeed a tribe of good science. So I particularly like this quote where science without open is an anecdote, which is a quote by Chris Hartering. And to illustrate that, there is a small infographic which suggests if you're just publishing your paper and then if you let it others to comment or others to read it, it's more or less on the side of the advertising. But when you increase the reproducibility spectrum by including data to the text that is associated and providing the codes through which you analyze such data, and also using a version control, that brings 100% of reproducibility spectrum, which should ideally be science. Can we really achieve that is the question. So now, when I say open science, for many of them, it might be a policy, maybe it's something that is a process, or for many it is a passion. But most of us are doing some parts of open science without even realizing whether we are doing that or not. So this Wheel of Open Science is one such tool where you can actually look into different methods on how you can open your science more, which is basically improving the degree of openness of your research itself. So all the slides will be available. So I've actually shared a scheduled tweet, so hopefully it should be there. So you could look into click into the links of all the materials that I've been sharing here. Yeah, so most of us might do some process of open science without realizing that we are doing. Can we actually do that more systematically is the current question. So when we do that, we always are concerned about final products because that is what is gearing up our careers. And when we publish an article, we usually do not know our right as an author. And you could know your right as an author and then spend a lot of time in figuring out whether you can post your manuscript into your personal website or somewhere else, or like an institutional repository, in order to gain or provide access to the whole world. So you need to figure out a lot of formalities, or like the rights that you're left for the publisher in times of when the manuscript is accepted. But there are easier tools such as Share Your Paper, which is quite recent from Open Access Button. So that is a tool where you can provide free and legal open access to your research materials or your research articles, where you can share your own research using this particular tool. And you can also access a lot of the legal free open access material or open access research articles using Open Access Button. So please feel free to check out that, particularly in this time when most of us are working from home and we might not be able to have regular access to our university-based subscriptions for all the research material that we might want to read. So to give a context more towards the whole topic that I wanted to talk about, which is equity, diversity, and inclusion in a lens of open science. I wanted to just pause and kind of redefine what equity means. So most of the audience here might already knew what equity means. So it's not about providing equal access, but actually helping everyone to reach their potential equally. So that is what equity means. And currently we are thinking about equal access to, or access to research articles or publications, but we are not putting equity into the whole scholarly communication. And there are also two other terms that I wanted to kind of define rather early on, where diversity is something that is present across, and it exists, and inclusion is where when diversity matches in order to be functionally viable. So that's depicted by these cartoons here, where you can have diversity that is just there. And if you want to acknowledge diversity, then you need to have inclusion, which is putting a framework in order for everyone to functionally participate so that it becomes more beautiful, like this tree with hands. So now with that context, we will look into whether the current traditional scientific publishing method, or the way we do science in general at different stages of the research cycle, are equitable, diverse, and inclusive, and also will provide some insights into how we can construct an equitable, diverse, and inclusive scholarship for the future. So when we look about, when we talk about scholarship, the global scholarship is usually skewed towards North American and European institutions, or the regions that are dominating. I mean, there's Australia that's also prominently present in this particular map. So this is a map that shows where most of the scholarly content is produced. And you could see that in a globe that looks much different, or a map that looks much different. We have high production of scholarly content by particular individuals or particular countries that are dominating. And this is one of the problems of not having equity, diversity, and inclusion. For example, I'm a person who has been trained in India. I might have come from a laboratory that might not have access to a lot of research materials that are very sophisticated, but I also came to Germany. I worked at the Max Planck Institute, which is one of the most sophisticated places that you could work. So I hold the privilege of having worked at such a place, and then having to produce a scholarly content, and then there's like the whole bunch of people who are producing scholarly content or research from other parts of the world, particularly Global South, are mostly excluded in the whole dialogue of knowledge production. That is blocked by different processes in the research life cycle, where when content is produced, it's usually peer-reviewed, And peer review is one process where there's a lot of gatekeeping that is happening currently through the publisher, but that is a process that might not perhaps need so much of gatekeeping. Rather, it needs to be gatekept by the community rather than the publisher. So one way to achieve equity or make inclusion possible is to use preprints as a method. So we might have known probably from looking into different preprints that are posted across all the preprint servers during pandemic. You might be familiar with most of these names, but these give a way to produce or provide access to content that is very quick and fast. But we do not allow equitable amount of peer review happening. And one such platform that I'm particularly recommending you to take a look is a peer review, which is a crowdsourced platform where one could do peer review, or one could train peer review as an early career researcher, and then provide comments or feedback on different preprints that are posted, which in a crowdsourced manner back to the authors. And this would actually provide a lot of legitimacy towards the community building within the scientific community, rather than few reviewers who are gatekeeping a particular article from the whole of scholarly publishing landscape. And when we consider producing knowledge, do we consider everyone as legitimate knowledge producers? We do not still include knowledge from the indigenous communities, or places where things could exist where that could become evidence-based medicine. I'm not here to advocate that one need to support hoax or pseudoscience that are imbibed in our cultural aspects of different traditional medicines, but to really put or test those methods and validate those knowledge and take them forward for an inclusive knowledge production. And I'm also pointing out the visible wiki women, where when there are a lot of women who are doing a great job within the technology and the scientific STEM in general, those women are excluded from, or they're not very visible. So the Visible Wiki Women Editathon makes it possible for visibility of people who are otherwise not well represented in the current knowledge database, considering Wikipedia as one of the knowledge database, or one of the largest encyclopedias online that we have. And that brings to the next point of having a hermeneutical injustice. So this is this is one of the examples that I kind of trying to point out, that a whole group, or like a whole country was refused to be acknowledged by the WHO in sharing their best practices, and this is only the tip of the iceberg, and we have similar issues on different schools of scientists who do not agree on each other, and there's also a whole judgmental issues on whether such kind of work or such kind of scientific work could come from certain place, and so on. So all of that, is one of the points where we need to really work into bringing equity and inclusion, whereby acknowledging that other perspectives exist with the right amount of evidence when shown. And one of the most important part is the trans, intersex, and non-binary inclusion in higher education. So most of the trans, intersex, and non-binary people are traditionally invisible within academia. And Alexis Johnson, who is an entrepreneur and running the Pineapple Laboratories, has started a mapping project where they look into policies of different higher education institutions which are inclusive, and you could find information about that in this particular link. So that is using an open source or open ideology in order to map out those policies and bring change in academic or higher education. Now the question would be, we can talk about all of that, but what would happen if nobody's following, or what would happen if everyone makes smaller changes? So since we have already had some introduction to anthropology, so imagine that several thousand years ago, we humans have mastered the idea of or the art of making tools. And from that point, we got into observing gravitational waves. And it all happened because a few of the individuals really cared about what they did. And if you really care about science in general and the way that we do our research, we need to probably reflect on our values at this particular moment and try and shift our practices more towards open science, or good science in general. So that brings us to the current state that we are in. We are all on Zoom calls probably. And how do we approach future from here is to utilize open science. Firstly, by talking about open science or using more open science in your current work, talking about it to your supervisors and your colleagues, and encouraging them to follow a workflow that is more open. And remember that opening up scholarship or science starts with you, and you can make the best and wise choice, and it's in your hands to do that. So open science will democratize knowledge when we go back, or when we get back from this pandemic. So that's actually the dictionary meaning of what democratize means. And hopefully all the education and higher education institutions will start to think about open science, and they would probably have to operate as digital enterprises in order to overcome this pandemic. And this would also provide seeking fundamental knowledge about the world around us by including every other perspective and every other knowledge that's available to our humankind. And I'd like to kind of close it up by saying open science is just a big umbrella term for different things that we do, including open access, open data, using open source methodologies, and having a citizen science or participatory approach in doing science, and putting equity, diversity, and inclusion into the whole current framework of doing research and innovating things in an open way. And also providing educational resources that would be openly available for anyone with access to internet, probably to access them, and then reuse, adapt, and share that widely with people who do not otherwise have access to internet. With that, I'd like to thank and say that hopefully open science, open scholarship will save our species and our planet. And I'd like to take questions, thoughts, and actions from your side. Thank you very much.